Welcome to Medmarc's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled Private Labeling of Medical Devices. I'm Kate Klaus, Senior Attorney in Medmarc's Risk Management Department. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenter, Sarah Lacey Robbins, thank you for joining us. Sarah Lacey Robbins is a Senior Quality Manager with Rook Quality Systems. She has more than a decade of experience in quality management, regulatory affairs, and project management in the medical device industry. Her work includes providing consulting services for compliance with FDA, EU, MDR, MDSAP, ISO, and IEC regulations, among others, and she has achieved multiple zero-finding FDA inspections for her clients. She is an expert in managing post-market quality activities, including CAPAs, audit responses, and process improvements. Sarah Lacey holds a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Winthrop University. And with that, I am pleased to turn things over to Sarah Lacey.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm excited to dive into this topic, but before we get started, let's talk about Rook. So as a consultant at Rook Quality Systems, we are your partner in quality. We offer expert consulting services tailored to your specific needs, whether that's complaint handling, CAPA management, audits, document control, QMS implementation, or quality and regulatory guidance and support. Our mission is to help you enhance compliance while optimizing cost efficiency. Rook supports a wide range of clients from innovative startups to established Fortune 500 companies. We specialize in building and maintaining customized quality systems and regulatory strategies for all types of medical devices, including combination products and software. So here is what we'll cover today: an introduction to private label medical devices, including key definition, types of private label medical devices, regulatory considerations, establishment registration and device listing, labeling requirements, including unique device identification or UDI, relationships and responsibilities, advantages of using private labels, best practices, and followed by a Q&A session at the end. So, what are private label medical devices? A private label medical device is a medical device that can be identical in all respects to a device manufactured by an original manufacturer or an original equipment manufacturer, or OEM for short, except that it is labeled with the private labeler's name, address, product name, and identifier. This enables multiple companies to bring similar or identical devices to market under distinct branding, while the OEM maintains control over design and production. In this arrangement, the company selling the device, referred to as the private label distributor or PLD or private labeler, is not the actual manufacturer, but markets and distributes the device under its own name or trademark. Private labeling can help manufacturers overcome challenges such as limited resources, financial constraints, or high production demands. It also allows companies to offer customized products without the need to invest in in-house development or manufacturing capabilities. But before we dive into that, let's go over some key definitions. So per FDA 21 CFR 820.3 clause 0 or subclause O, the term manufacturer is defined as manufacturer means any person who designs, manufactures, fabricates, or assembles or processes a finished device. Manufacturer includes, but is not limited to those who perform the functions of contract sterilization, installation, relabeling, remanufacture, repackaging, or specification development, and initial distributors of foreign entities performing those functions. An original manufacturer has the same meaning as manufacturer in these regulations. I may often refer to them throughout this session as OEM, as mentioned previously. Also, as previously stated, a private label medical device is a medical device that can be identical with all respects to the device manufactured by the OEM, except it is branded with the private labeler's name, address, product name, and identifier. Therefore, a private labeler is a company who sells a private label medical device under their own name or trademark. So let's talk about the types of private label medical devices. White label are private label medical devices that are manufactured by an OEM for a private labeler that offers less customization, usually generic, which are sold to multiple private labelers. These are typically low-risk devices. Whereas a black label are private label medical devices that are manufactured by an OEM specifically for a single private labeler and may involve customization or modifications to meet that labeler's unique requirements. These are typically exclusive use devices under a single brand. The process of private labeling a medical device is negotiated directly between the private labeler and the OEM. As a result, a robust supplier management process, including clear roles, responsibilities, and quality agreements between both parties, is essential to ensure compliance and product quality. It is important to note that the FDA is not directly involved in the private labeling process. However, private label arrangements must still comply with all applicable FDA regulations, such as device registration, complaint handling, adverse event reporting, recall procedures, labeling, and importing. The specific regulatory pathway for a medical device depends on its classification and associated FDA product code, and may involve a 510(k) pre-market notification, de novo classification, pre-market approval or PMA, or other applicable route. Accurately identifying the device's classification and product code is essential for determining the appropriate regulatory pathway. In many cases, a private label distributor is not required to submit a new 510(k) if the original OEM has a cleared 510(k) for that device, and there is no change to the device's intended use, performance, function, or technological characteristics. However, under 21 CFR 807.81a, a new 510(k) is required if there is a significant modification that could affect the device's safety or effectiveness, such as a substantial change in design, materials, energy source, manufacturing process, or intended use. In such cases, the OEM must update or submit a new 510(k). Additionally, the OEM must list the devices correctly under the FDA registration. And if the device is marketed under the private labeler's name, the private labeler must also be identified appropriately in the FDA's device listing. While private labelers typically do not need to submit a 510(k), they must have authorization from the OEM and may be subject to establishment registration and device listing requirements depending on their activities. So let's dive into establishment registration and device listing. Even though a private labeler does not manufacture medical devices, they may still have responsibility under FDA regulations depending on their role. If a private labeler solely distributes devices without engaging in manufacturing, repackaging, relabel, specification development, or acting as the initial importer, they are not generally required to register their establishment or list the device under 21 CFR 807. However, if the device is marketed under the private labeler's own name or trade name, the device must be listed in the FDA's database under that name. In such cases, the original manufacturer or specification developer must be properly registered and hold the 510(k) clearance or exemption, must authorize the private labeler to reference the regulatory documentation. The private labeler does not submit a new 510(k), but instead relies on the original manufacturer's clearance. The manufacturer must then cross-reference the private labeler in their FDA device listing, indicating that the same device is marketed but under the private label. The FDA does not allow the same device to be listed under multiple 510(k)s unless it's been legally re-cleared. So typically, private labelers will piggyback off the original manufacturer's submission. However, a new 510(k) is only required for re-clearance, such as the private label's device contains a significant change from the original device, which impacts the device's performance, function, and intended use. For domestic OEMs based in the USA, It is their responsibility to maintain the device listing in the FDA's FURLS or FDA Unified Registration and Listing System. When the device is marketed under a private label, the OEM must update the existing listing to indicate the private labeling brand and designate the private labeler as a distributor, not as a manufacturer. If the private labeler is solely engaging in distribution and does not perform manufacturing, relabeling, repackaging, or specification development, they are not generally required to register their own establishment with the FDA. For foreign OEMs, those that are outside of the US, the regulatory requirements differ slightly. The foreign establishment must register with the FDA and designate a US agent to serve as a primary contact for FDA communications. In this scenario, the private labeler or distributor based in the US must identify as the importer of record and is responsible for ensuring that the device complies with all applicable FDA importation and labeling requirements. These steps are essential to maintaining traceability, regulatory compliance, and transparency across supply chain, particularly when labeling, importing, and distributing responsibilities are handled by separate entities. So let's discuss labeling requirements. The key labeling requirements for private label medical devices per 21 CFR Part 801 for 801.1a, which states that the label of a packaged medical device must conspicuously display the name and place of business of the manufacturer, packager, or distributor. This means the label must clearly tell the end user who is responsible for the product, whether that's the OEM or the private label company. Now, under 801.1c, if the company listed on the label is not the actual manufacturer, the label must qualify that relationship. So for a private label device, this means using language like manufactured for the corporation or distributed by the corporation. This prevents misleading users into thinking the private labeler is the manufacturer when they're not. In the context of private labeling, this is especially important because the OEM often makes the same product for multiple companies. Therefore, the OEM typically does not want to be listed on the label to avoid revealing those relationships or undercutting their own brand. Now, failure to follow these labeling rules can lead to misbranding under the FD&C Act. A device may be considered misbranded if the label misrepresents who the manufacturer is, the private labeler hasn't registered or listed the device as required, or if the label includes claims that go beyond what is cleared in the original 510K. So clear, truthful, and properly qualified labeling is not just best practice, it's regulatory requirement to stay compliant and avoid enforcement actions. So let's talk about unique device identification, or UDI. UDI is required on device labeling and packaging per FDA 21 CFR Part 830 and 801.20. Labeling must include UDI in both human readable and machine readable, or AIDC format, and applies to all finished labeling devices, including private labels. I have included an example to show and add clarity to the different components of the UDI label for general context. Under FDA regulation, the labeler is defined as the person or entity that causes a label to be applied to a device or modified with the intent for commercial distribution. This includes private labelers, even if the original equipment manufacturer physically prints and applies the label. The private labeler is still considered the legal labeler if the device is marketed under their name. This designation is particularly relevant under the FDA's UDI regulations. The labeler's responsibilities include the UDI compliance. In most private label scenarios, this is the private labeler, as their name appears on the label. The labeler must also ensure that the UDI is properly assigned by an FDA-accredited issuing agency and accurately submitted to the FDA's Global Unique Device Identification Database, or GUDID. So the differences between a white and black private label device is a white label, typically the OEM will handle the UDI, especially if there are multiple variants under the same product family and share the same DI. For black label, UDI is specific to the private labeler's branded version. Therefore, a new device identifier is often required. Regardless, whichever party is identified to be the responsible labeler, they would also be responsible for the UDI. This is often where confusion arises. FDA allows the delegation of UDI tasks, so while a private labeler may contract the OEM to obtain the UDIs and submit the data into the GUDID on behalf of the legally responsible UDI compliance requirements, it will always remain with the private labeler, since they are the official labeler under FDA regulations. Let's review some scenarios to illustrate how this plays out in practice. In my experience, labeling ownership is one of the most frequently misunderstood and debated topics. It can be especially confusing when trying to determine who actually, quote unquote, owns the labeling. That is, who is responsible for creating, approving, and maintaining control of the labeling within their quality management system. In many cases, the OEM is responsible for label control. However, the private labeler may require final review and approval, even though they do not quote unquote own the label. These are examples of what's known as supervised labeling control. If the private labeler is involved in repackaging, relabeling, or reprocessing activities, they are considered to quote unquote own the labeling and are also responsible for UDI and GUDID registration. When the same device is sold under a different brand, a unique global trade item number, or GTIN, must be assigned. Typically, the private labeler will be responsible for this. This enables the private labeler to manage product tracking across distinct supply chains, monitor inventory, and conduct targeted recalls if needed. However, the decision regarding the labeling responsibility may vary depending on the desired ownership of the market. With that in mind, the next topic we'll explore is how to clearly define roles and responsibilities within the private label relationship. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to defining responsibilities in private label medical devices. Each partnership between the private labeler and the OEM is unique and must be tailored based on the nature of the device, regulatory responsibilities, and commercial arrangements. The key is to establish a robust supplier quality agreement, or SQA, as it is the most critical tool to clearly outline regulatory and operational responsibilities early in the relationship, helping to prevent compliance gaps, misunderstandings, and operational conflicts. Private labels are all about ownership and responsibility. As there is no standard process for private labels, it's generally based on the responsibility. So there are a lot of different avenues. That's why an SQA is critical. A robust supplier agreement is essential for private label arrangements. It serves as the foundation for assigning and documenting quality and regulatory responsibilities between the OEM and the private labeler. An effective supplier quality agreement should include a detailed scope of the relationship and regulatory context, roles and responsibility for design, production, labeling, and post-market activities, quality system requirements such as document control, CAPA, internal audits, complaint handling and medical device reporting responsibilities, procedures for change control, including required notifications, expectations for audits, record retention, and regulatory inspections, and clear process for recall coordination and field actions. The SQA should be reviewed periodically, especially in response to changes in regulations. such as the FDA's transition to the QMSR in February of next year. Product scope or supplier performance. A well-maintained supplier quality agreement protects both parties and is often scrutinized during FDA inspections. Now that you have an idea of what an SQA should entail, let's review an example. So for respective SQA inclusions, I have identified the private labeling responsibilities in Section X example. So Section X.1 for regulatory authority defines the manufacturer or original manufacturer with said company name shall maintain legal ownership and control of all applicable FDA regulatory submissions, including but not limited to the 510(k) pre-market notification and technical documentation for the devices covered by this agreement. Section X.2 identifies the labeling and branding. The private labeler in this example shall provide final label artwork, including name, address, and product name and branding elements for the original manufacturer's approval prior to initial commercialization and distribution. The label must include the phrase manufactured for or distributed by as required under 21 CFR 801.1c. The company agrees not to label the device with the original manufacturer's information without prior written approval. So let's continue into Section X.3, Establishment, Registration, and Device Listing. The private labeler is responsible for registering their establishment with the FDA and ensuring the device is appropriately listed under their name via cross-reference to the original manufacturer's product code and 510(k) number. The original manufacturer shall grant authorization via referrals or written letter allowing the listing by the private labeler. Section X.4 identifies unique device identification or UDI requirements. The private labeler is responsible for submitting UDI records to the FDA's DUDID database under their labeler account and ensuring alignment with the device listing. And then for Section 5, it outlines complaints, adverse events, and recalls, where the original manufacturer has listed to retain the responsibility for complaint handling, MDR reporting, and recalls, unless otherwise stated. The private labeler agrees to forward all customer complaints or adverse events report within X business days to the original manufacturer. Now, the X business days is generally going to be a business decision, but it's typically recommended 3 to 5 business days. So what are the advantages of using private labels? Private labeling offers several strategic advantages for companies entering or expanding within the medical device market. One of the primary benefits is brand and market ownership. Companies can offer FDA-cleared medical devices under their own brand without the significant investment required for product development or manufacturing infrastructure. This approach enables companies to rapidly expand their product portfolios, enhance brand recognition, and establish a stronger presence in their target markets. It also facilitates faster market entry, since private labelers often negotiate exclusive distribution rights or product customization options, thus reducing competition from identical products marketed under different brand names. Additional benefits also include supplier flexibility and diversification. Companies can choose from a range of manufacturers, helping manage costs and supply chain risks. Reduce time to market. Without the need for R&D and production setup, products can launch much faster. Focus on core competencies. Businesses can concentrate on marketing, sales, and customer support while relying on experienced manufacturers for production and regulatory compliance. Overall, private labeling is cost-effective, scalable, and low-risk strategies that support commercial growth and market agility in the medical device sector. So let's go over some best practices. For some of you, this may have been a lot to take in. So let's highlight these best practices. Whether you're the private labeler or the original equipment manufacturer, it's essential to follow these key guidelines to ensure regulatory compliance and operational success. Establish a robust supplier quality agreement to clearly define the roles and responsibilities related to design, manufacturing, labeling, complaint handling, and regulatory reporting. Ensure proper FDA registration and device listing. The original manufacturer must list the device with the FDA, including the private labeler's brand name. The private labeler is typically registered as the distributor. Comply with labeling and UDI requirements. Use accurate and compliant labeling, including the correct brand name. Maintain up-to-date records in the UDI and GUDID databases. And define complaint handling and medical device reporting processes. Ensure timely communication and assign clear responsibilities for medical device reporting obligations. And implement change control and communication protocols. Agree on procedures for notifying and approving any changes to the product or the manufacturing process. Address import and customs compliance. If applicable, foreign manufacturers must appoint a U.S. agent and ensure proper labeling and customs and FDA import requirements. Monitor regulatory updates and adapt agreements. Stay informed about changes in FDA regulations and update internal procedures and agreements as needed. And prepare for relationship transitions or terminations. Define clear exit strategies, including responsibilities for maintaining or transferring product registrations and documentation. Thank you for attending. I'm happy to answer any questions you have now. If you would like to connect afterwards or have any business-specific questions, feel free to email me directly at sarah.robbins@rookqs.com or visit Rook Quality Systems. So let's get started with some pre-webinar questions. The first question is regarding the relationship between the FDA and the OEM. So just to re-clarify, the OEM must register their facilities annually and list each medical device they manufacture using FDA's Unified Registration and Listing System referrals as required by 21 CFR 807. This process formally establishes the OEM's accountability and makes them directly answerable to the FDA. Under 21 CFR Part 820, OEMs must implement and maintain a comprehensive quality management system, which includes, but not limited to, design controls, risk management under ISO 14971, corrective and preventative actions, document control, labeling, packaging, production process controls, and so much more. While these requirements apply across the board, OEMs may tailor elements of their QMS based on the company's size, device type, and scope of operations. OEMs should anticipate FDA on-site inspections, and OEMs are responsible for managing corrections, removals, and recalls under 21 CFR 806. I also have an additional question that was provided pertaining to licensing rates and other fees. So one thing to note that was not covered in this presentation is regarding the FDA annual registration. So the annual registration fee is roughly $9,280 US. There is no waiver for small businesses. And I know another topic we had mentioned is 510K pre-market notifications. So the submission fee for this, for any new 510Ks, is roughly about $24,335 US. There is a small business designation reduction to reduce it to $6,084 US. And if you are curious about any additional FDA fees, I would recommend going to the FDA's website and search Medical Device User Fee Amendments, or MEDUFA, which will go into detail regarding application type and associated costs. Now, we also had an additional question that's a really good question regarding transferring 510Ks and what processes would need to occur to label made in the USA. So to accomplish a 510K transfer, the OEM must transfer ownership of the 510K to the purchaser and cease its manufacturing activities for the device to comply with the transfer requirements. If the device remains unchanged in design, components, or manufacturing methods or intended use, the new owner does not need to submit a new 510K. And if the purchaser is not already registered with the FDA, it will have 30 days beginning manufacturing and listing activities to comply with this. The company will also need to register the establishment and list the device in the FDA's FURL system, including the original 510K number. The new 510K holder must also update labeling and UDI/GUDI listing to reflect this update and notify the FDA of the change of ownership and manufacturing. And then that's also applicable if, say, you change the brand name of the device. You'll have to notify the FDA. And then lastly, in order to claim made in the USA, the manufacturer must be registered with the FDA, physically located in the US, and perform the final substantial assembly or processing on US soil, and ensure that all or virtually all components and manufacturing steps occur domestically per FTC's 16 CFR 323 ruling guidance. And then I also had one last question regarding general wellness devices versus medical devices, and how is this applicable for private labeling, which is also a very good question. So for everyone's awareness, a general wellness product are products intended to promote a healthy lifestyle or general fitness, but do not make claims regarding diagnosing, treating, curing, or preventing any disease or medical condition. Typically, these are products that are not regulated as medical devices by the FDA because they do not make a medical claim. So the FDA is very lenient on this classification, only focusing on ensuring that no false or misleading claims are made. Whereas a medical device, it's intended for use in diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. So this is going to be your examples of blood glucose meters, insulin pumps, AED, wound care bandages, etc. These products require FDA clearance in most cases, such as a 510K or PMA or specified exemptions or special controls, and require quality management system under the quality system regulations. They also are applicable to labeling requirements, adverse events, and etc. And these are generally going to be classified as low risk class 1 to middle risk and high risk class 2s and 3s. So if a product is a general wellness product, the private labeler must ensure that the marketing claims stay within the general wellness guidance to avoid triggering FDA's medical device regulation. And that's all the pre-questions I had. Do we have any new questions that have come in?
Hi, Sarah, Lacey. Yes, we do have a few questions from our listeners. First, could you discuss how is private labeling controlled for CE mark devices under the EU MDR?
So how it's, I mean, that's outside the scope of this, as this is primarily focused on FDA. But if you are looking at from a device that is currently being marketed in the, like under CE marking in EU MDR, and then looking to transfer that into being sold as a private label under FDA requirements, it would be handled very similarly to how I explained it, with the private labeler needing to be registered with the FDA and be classified as the initial importer. However, the technical file will be the responsibility of the OEM. So they would, whether it's the agreement defines that they're going to share the technical file with the private labeler or keep it separate. That's going to determine if say you have a direct submission for a 510K for the US being, either proprietary or direct relationship, but generally the private labeler would own that 510K submission because they're ultimately going to bring that product to the US. Now, in a situation like that, the private labeler is going to basically own the market because they're going to have the submission backing. But typically in those situations, if the OEM is prioritizing the US market, they may own the submission and then let the private labeler piggyback. So this is why I stress that supplier quality agreements are very important, because in a situation like this, you're going to have market, like a fight over the market basically, because whoever gets that brand in first owns the market, from like the device portfolio standpoint. Now, in terms of ownership of private labels in Europe and internationally recognized, you're going to be diving into a whole bunch of country-specific requirements. So that would possibly be a very good topic for additional webinar, but you are going to be looking at the general practices of what we discussed regarding like UDI and the GUDID database, but the country registration is ultimately going to need to be defined in that SQA, and then the labeling requirements. So say certain countries have specific labeling, language requirements that would need to be identified, who's going to basically own the label. So that ties back into, supplier quality agreement, who's going to own the label, who's going to own the, country specific registration, and who's going to ultimately be distributing that device or product portfolio. So you're going to have a massive battle between OEM and private labeler at that point.
Thank you. We had an additional question as well. This is about the classification terminology for the manufacturer and the private label manufacturer on the label itself. So instead of using terminology like manufactured for, they're wondering if you could use something like legal manufacturer.
So with that, you have primarily three options. You have manufactured by, and that's going to be applicable to your manufacturer, and that's only going to be used in the instance your OEM feels comfortable displaying that they're the manufacturer. But if the OEM does not, because say they have relationships with other customers and there's tons of private labels that they work on, they're not going to feel comfortable with that. So you have the only other option to have the distributed by or the manufactured for. But your terminology is going to be very limited, because you don't want to approach that brand misbranding by saying, we are, going to repackage this. No, you have to be very explicit and have the confirmation from your OEM. You can have some select words like, prioritize distribution for, or, you can get kind of creative with, not necessarily breaking those regulatory and legal bounds, but I would generally recommend keeping it the manufactured for or the distributed by. And then if your OEM feels comfortable having, manufactured by, your OEM, but again, it's going to be how comfortable your OEM is doing that at that point. Because in the industry, you might have some private labelers that for some niche medical devices might be the sole manufacturer globally for one device, and then they private label hundreds of other private labels. So they're not going to want that, because they may also have their own brand too, and they don't want to undercut sales from them, because you're going to look at them and go, oh, I've heard this brand before. It's very predominant in the US. I'm going to buy it. And then they're missing out on revenue. So it's a very tricky game of disclosure when it comes to private labels.
We have one last question. This may be a bit specific and outside of the scope. So if this is not something you're comfortable answering, we can certainly take this one offline. But if an FDA registered company is importing class 1 analyte specific reagents, and they are the initial importer of those reagents, should they be listing those products on their facility registration with FDA?
Yep, because they are the initial importer, they are obligated to. So they're going to be handling the labeling requirements, the claims, and depending on the situation, they could possibly be the US agent, or if they're outsourcing that. But yes, they would want to disclose what products they're actually importing and distributing.
Thank you very much, Sarah Lacey. This has been a topic that we encounter on a regular basis, and we know your expertise will be really valuable for our clients.
Yeah, always happy to help. I enjoy talking about this topic. So please feel free to reach out to me if you're in a tricky situation. I'm always happy to help.
And we'll have to keep the EU version of this topic in mind for another webinar.
Yeah, I would love to do a EU and global, because it gets very tricky with some of those situations.